Hey, what's up? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about the journeys I went through when questioning my orientation and my gender, how those two different experiences were similar and different, and what I learned from both. In my last video, I talked about how the queer community can do better by questioning folks, and in this video, I want to expand on the topic of questioning by sharing my own experience with it. I went through 2 rounds of questioning, first one for my orientation and then one for my gender, so I want to take you through both of those journeys, do a little compare and contrast, and share some wisdom that might help you if you're questioning. First, to set the stage, I did my questioning later in life. I was in my mid-20s when I questioned my orientation, and on the cusp of turning 30 when I started questioning my gender. And just because I don't want to keep y'all in suspense, I'll go ahead and tell you the conclusions I came to. For my orientation, I am demi-romantic / technically bi but in a gay way, and asexual. And for my gender, I am non-binary transgender, specifically gender fluid, oscillating in a space between transmasculine and genderqueer. And that's a lot of words, so I often just call myself queer for simplicity's sake. Okay, without further ado, let's get into how I figured all of that out. Part 1. Questioning my orientation. This process actually started when I was questioning something else. What went wrong with my last relationship? I was just trying to heal a broken heart at the time. I never in a million years thought it would end up with me realizing I wasn't straight. That relationship was a long-term serious one with one of my best friends who later turned into a romantic partner, and I thought we would be together for the rest of our lives. But we turned out to be incompatible, particularly around sex. He wanted to take things further and faster than I did, constantly pressured me about my boundaries, cheated on me when I enforced them, and tried to frame his actions as my fault, so that obviously put our relationship to an end. It also sent me down a path of self-reflection as I tried to figure out what, if anything, I could have done differently. I sought out as many similar stories to my own as I could find through social media posts, advice columns, you name it. And one thing that jumped out at me was that apparently being in your mid-20s and still not wanting to have sex with your partner after 2 years together was weird. It had never occurred to me that I was weird for that or that it was anything unusual. Of course, I had noticed as I went through my teens and 20s that most of my peers around me were having sex and I wasn't, but I never felt like the odd one out for that. Maybe that was because I grew up in the Bible Belt South where there's a lot of social pressure to wait for marriage. Maybe it was because I had assumed I was a late bloomer and I would eventually want to have sex at the right time with the right person. But either way, I thought my experience of not having sex was a normal one, not a weird one. Another thing I figured out in the wake of that breakup was that there was a very distinct pattern to the way that I developed crushes on people. Which was that it only ever happened if I knew the other person well, and the strength of my romantic feelings for them tended to be directly proportional to how close we were. Essentially, that meant my dating pool was just my friends. I had been frustrated by this in the past because having a crush meant risking an existing friendship dynamic if I confessed my feelings, but I'd never really thought about it as a specific pattern until after that breakup. That's because I was considering my romantic future and realizing how much the world had shifted to apps for meeting and dating people, and it became crystal clear that that would never work for me and why. So once I understood that I was only capable of developing crushes on people I was close to, and that this was apparently as unusual as my weird feelings about sex, I started looking for other people who felt the same way I did. So I sort of jokingly Googled friend sexual to find out if that was a thing, and what came up was the word demisexual. That's how I discovered there was an actual orientation term for people who could only be attracted to those they had developed an emotional bond with first. And that sounded exactly like me, so I was jumping for joy inside, until I also learned that demisexual fell under the asexual umbrella. Because even if I did have some apparently weird perspectives about sex, I didn't think I could possibly be asexual. After all, regardless of how my relationship had ended, I still thought sex was something I would want someday. I still had a libido. I still found media with sexual content really entertaining and thought of sex as just a fascinating subject in general. So how could I be ace, right? I'd first heard about asexuality on some random documentary I saw on TV when I was about 19 or 20, and everyone they interviewed for that documentary seemed to find both sex and romance completely repulsive and were only interested in platonic friendships. And that didn't sound like me at all, so I was really struggling with how demisexual seemed like such a perfect word for who I was, except for the fact that it was a subset of asexuality, which didn't seem like such a good fit. Until I did some more reading and learned that asexuality is actually a whole spectrum. I learned about the difference between sexual attraction and things that other people commonly mix it up with, like libido or sex favorability. And I realized that my first impression of asexuality was a completely inaccurate one. Once I got the full picture of what asexuality was, I realized I did relate to it after all, very strongly, and that kind of blew my mind. I also learned about the split attraction model, the concept of different types of attraction, such as sexual, romantic, sensual, platonic, and others. Before that, I'd always thought that attraction was just attraction, like a package deal. So if you thought someone was good looking and wanted to date them, then surely you must want to have sex with them too. But my own relationship had proved that wrong, because no matter how strongly I had been romantically attracted to my ex-partner, sexual attraction had just never happened. And after loving him so deeply and being together for so long, could I really say it was because he wasn't the right person? In my mid-20s, could I really say that I was a late bloomer? Or had I just been asexual all along? That seemed to be the case, and that terrified me. I have another video about all the reasons why I was scared to come out as asexual to myself, much less to anyone else, so I'm not going to go into that here. I'll just say that it took an embarrassingly long time to come to terms with it. Embarrassing because ever since I was a teenager, I had been very strongly connected to the queer community. So I'd always thought, first of all, if I was queer, I would have figured it out much, much sooner than I did. And second, I would have celebrated it, just like I celebrated all my friends who were out and proud. But apparently this lovely society we live in had injected me with just enough internalized queerphobia to make self-acceptance and coming out seem difficult, if not impossible. To make matters worse, I was well aware of the discourse around aces and whether we counted as queer enough, something I talked about a lot in my last video about how the queer community can better support questioning folks. When I was questioning, this discourse was the exact opposite of support. It was hostile and cruel and filled me with self-doubt. Even when I could finally accept myself as queer, I didn't think my queer friends would accept me as queer because I was ace. I think what stands out the most in my memory about questioning my orientation was how isolated and lonely I felt the entire time. I didn't know any other aces I could talk to, and it's one thing to read posts or watch videos from aces and think, oh, that's so relatable, versus actually talking to another ace. And I didn't think I could talk to any of my allo friends, including the queer ones, because I just didn't think they'd understand. I spent 2 whole years knowing I was ace and feeling like I couldn't tell a soul. And the whole time I was still living in this very allonormative world with all of its pressures and expectations. I was hearing casual acephobia around me every day and just biting my tongue. It felt like I'd locked myself in a prison, and I desperately wanted out. I wanted to be able to share this huge new thing I'd discovered about myself and stop pretending to be someone I wasn't. But it took a long time before I was comfortable enough to do that. Once I finally did, it made a huge difference. I have met so many other aces, both online and in person, and I have a lot of ace friends. In fact, most of my closest circle of friends are fellow aces. I've been embraced by my other queer friends and my local queer community as well, and I have never encountered even a whiff of the discourse in real life. I feel happy and confident as an out and proud ace, and I could never go back in the closet. Coming out as demi-romantic was good too, but also a little bit different. I realized I was demi-romantic after learning about the split attraction model, and that demi-romantic asexual was a much more accurate way to describe myself, despite how perfect the word demisexual had seemed at first. But even once I knew my label, I struggled a little bit with the proud part of out and proud, because I found myself wishing that I could be aromantic rather than demi-romantic. More than 5 years after the breakup that had gotten me thinking about my orientation in the first place, I made a new friend, and over time I eventually developed romantic feelings for him. And I found myself really missing that 5-year period in between where I'd had no romantic feelings whatsoever, where I was functionally aromantic. I did start talking about my romantic orientation more and connecting with other demi-romantic folks, and that made me feel a lot more supported. But unfortunately, it didn't make me stop wishing I could just be aromantic instead. What's helped the most with that is telling myself, just because you might get a rare occasional crush doesn't mean you have to act on it. You don't ever have to date or be in a relationship ever again. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned that in addition to being demi, my romantic orientation also included being technically bi, but in a gay way. I have another video explaining how I came to that conclusion, so I'm just going to link to that instead of repeating everything here. But I did want to mention it because figuring that out wasn't possible until after I had questioned my gender. So let's dive into that story next. Part 2: Questioning my gender. In the spring of 2016, there was a very specific thing I did that put the first crack in my egg: wearing a beard. I did this for my Bucky Barnes cosplay, but after I took off the costume, I found myself inexplicably not wanting to take off the beard. I thought I looked really good in it, and I'd felt this glowing sense of joy all day anytime someone had complimented it or thought I had grown it instead of just applying it with mascara. I didn't start actively questioning my gender until the spring of 2017, but during that year in between, I wore the beard over and over again for other cosplay events, and I experienced those same feelings of joy every time. And I eventually reached a point where I could no longer ignore or deny what those feelings meant. I was experiencing gender euphoria. I also had 2 moments that, looking back, I would classify as gender dysphoria, but I didn't perceive it that way at the time. One was when I was cosplaying as Bucky at a charity event, and a kid came up to me and said, "I know you're really a girl, so how are you able to grow a beard?" And my immediate reaction inside was, how do you know what I really am? And then right on the heels of that, wait, what? Because cis people don't have thoughts like that. The other one was at a comic convention where I was cosplaying as Jughead Jones, and I tried my hand at an androgynous gender presentation for the first time. And I liked the way that looked on me too. It gave me similar feelings of happiness that wearing the beard did. Until another con-goer gave me a well-meaning but very off-the-mark compliment about my cute girl version of Jughead, and I was just thinking, where did I go wrong with this aesthetic if it's giving off cute girl vibes? Which, again, is not a very cis thought. And that was actually what prompted me to finally confront all of these weird gender feelings I'd been having for the last year. The very next day, I went home from that con and I started looking up as many resources online as I could about being non-binary, because I heavily suspected that's what I most likely was. At this point, I had known about non-binary genders for maybe 4 or 5 years, and funny enough, the first time I ever heard of them, my initial reaction was not, "Oh good, there's a word for what I am." Instead, I thought, that sounds fake, but okay, because surely if non-binary genders were a real thing, I would have heard of them before I was in my mid-20s, right? But then I remembered that the US education system sucks at teaching about anything queer, and no, actually, there was a very good chance I wouldn't have heard of them before then. Then I started meeting non-binary people, first in art and comic spaces online, and later at conventions when I started cosplaying. Which proved that yes, actually, non-binary genders are a thing, and no, they are not fake, and it forced me to rethink everything that had ever been ingrained in me about gender from the time I was a little kid. But of course, it still took several years before I was able to apply any of these new things I had learned about gender to myself. It wasn't until I was at this convention at the ripe old age of 29, being told I looked like a cute girl, that it finally hit me like a truck that I was not, in fact, a cute girl, or a girl at all. I'm really glad that by this point, I already had a solid and accurate understanding of what things like non-binary and transgender meant, unlike when I was questioning my orientation and coming into it with all these misconceptions about asexuality. I didn't have to work through those kinds of misconceptions about gender as part of my questioning process because I'd already done that earlier. I could just focus on figuring out what my own gender was. And I knew that was going to be a complicated process. There are a lot of aspects to my gender that probably seem contradictory or don't make a lot of sense to the average outside observer. Like why I enjoy wearing makeup and nail polish when I'm not a woman. Or why I feel affirmed by he/him pronouns but don't feel good about they/them pronouns when I'm non-binary. And when I first started questioning, none of this made sense to me either. But that's the whole point of questioning, to work through all of this stuff and untangle it. So I was prepared for that process to take a lot of time and to be messy and non-linear and require a lot of trial and error and exploration. What I wasn't prepared for was to deal with more of the isolation and loneliness that I'd experienced when I was questioning my orientation. So I decided to take an entirely different approach this time, and I told my friends I was questioning. I feel like a lot of us think we need to do our questioning on our own and know what the answers are before we come out. But there is a lot to be said for just coming out as questioning. For telling the people in your life, hey, I'm just getting started on this journey, I don't know where I'm going to end up, but I trust you enough to take you on it with me. It lifted such a huge weight off my shoulders to be able to do that, and I have zero regrets. Now, I will say I would have never had the guts to come out as questioning my gender if I hadn't already gone through that first process of questioning my orientation. That experience took the edge off in a lot of ways. It got me over that initial hurdle of, oh my god, am I queer? It let me know I could trust my friends to be supportive. It proved that questioning was something I could do and come out happier on the other side. So I was lucky enough to be able to question my gender with my friends knowing about it and didn't have to hide or pretend around them. I was able to talk to other folks in the trans and non-binary community and learn new things, gain new perspectives on gender, commiserate over shared experiences, you name it. I also had several friends who came out to me as questioning, either about their orientation or their gender, and they said they felt like they could do that because I had already come out as questioning first. So then we all got to be in this big questioning boat together. Just as I had suspected, questioning my gender did indeed take a long time. In the summer of 2017, I started exploring in two ways, experimenting with gender expression and doing a lot of self-reflection on my internal sense of gender. And that eventually made me feel confident enough to come out as non-binary trans, specifically gender fluid, by December 2018. At that point, my focus shifted from questioning my gender to starting my social transition and eventually looking into medical transition. And in a way, that was its own other questioning process, figuring out the best path forward with transitioning in a way that would boost gender euphoria and alleviate dysphoria as much as possible. So that led to things like changing my pronouns, getting progressively more gender-affirming haircuts, and finally starting testosterone in June of 2022. And I just want to point out that timeline again. First crack in the egg in 2016, started actively questioning in 2017, came out in 2018, started T in 2022. That is 6 years, and the gender journey is still ongoing. Which is just to say that when it comes to questioning and coming out and living your truth, there's no rush and no set timeline. You gotta do it at a pace that works for you. I also want to point out that sometimes, even when you think you're well past questioning, you can still learn new things about yourself. That's what happened with my romantic orientation after I came out as trans. Someone made an offhand comment that really drove home the point that my romantic attraction to dudes was gay now. And I was just like, oh, because even though that was true, I had just never thought of myself as gay. And I'm sure there are more new things I'll learn about myself as I continue with my transition, even though I'm no longer questioning my gender in the way that I was at the beginning. Taking different steps in your transition can bring new thoughts and feelings to light sometimes, and I'm fully anticipating that and embracing that bit of unpredictability. So that's pretty much the story of my gender questioning process, and now I want to wrap this up with some final thoughts. Part 3. Conclusions. I learned some amazing lessons and gained really valuable insights from both of my questioning journeys. First, questioning is harder when you do it alone. Maybe it's safer that way, especially when you aren't sure who you can trust to be supportive. But I ultimately found that the stress of keeping something that big to myself for so long far outweighed any fears about being rejected for who I was. I definitely learned that the hard way when questioning my orientation, and I'm very glad that I took a different approach to questioning my gender. It makes a big difference when you have a network of people around you who can relate to what you're going through. So I highly recommend building that while you're questioning instead of tackling all of it on your own. Second, questioning can shift not only your understanding of yourself, but also your entire worldview. And that can be hard to come to grips with. I feel fortunate that I'm the kind of person who enjoys learning new things that challenge my beliefs and open my mind up to new ones. But even so, I still struggled with the fact that I made it all the way to my mid-20s thinking I understood how attraction worked or what gender was, only to learn that I didn't really know the half of it. And third, there is nothing wrong with questioning later in life. I had a lot of imposter syndrome about the fact that I was questioning my orientation in my mid-20s and my gender from the age of 29 into my early 30s. I wondered why I was het-lagged for so long and whether that meant I was faking my queerness. And even when I got past that, I still felt like an idiot for not realizing it sooner. But there are so many reasons why some of us just don't question until we're older. Society assumes we're straight and cis until proven otherwise, and it doesn't educate us about who we might be instead. And it's not always obvious. In my case, my aspec orientation and my non-binary gender identity were really hard to pinpoint because they're characterized more by who you're not than who you are. So those kinds of things can easily keep you stuck thinking you're cis and straight for years. And it doesn't make you any less queer when you finally figure out the truth, no matter what age you are. Alright, now is when I want to hear from you. Have you ever questioned your orientation or your gender or both, and if so, how did it go? What were some of the most interesting or unexpected things that you encountered on your journey? Now that I've shared my stories, I would love to hear yours, so drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person. I've got cosplay music videos, I've got makeup demos, pre-testosterone voice recordings, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. I hope you learned something, and I will see you on the next one.